Everybody, I think we are going to get started. This is an invited roundtable, and it's sponsored by the Committee for World Anthropologies and the WCAA. The idea of the roundtable is to try to address this trend of internationalization and conversations among different traditions of anthropological knowledge that has been going on for a while already in the last 10 years. Basically, our invited speakers here in the roundtable represent, on the one hand, a drive towards the institutionalization of these kinds of connections among different anthropologists. On the other hand, we have other speakers who represent the let's say, national traditions of anthropology in different areas of the world, and are more situated in the, let's say, grassroots aspect of this internationalization of anthropological knowledge. So basically, my idea when I thought about this roundtable was to address a series of issues. On the one hand, the issue around the kind of tension that arises between grassroots mobilizations towards the internationalization and towards the conversation among different anthropologies, and I would have the example of the original, let's say, movement of the World Anthropological the World Anthropological Network, or the Red de Antropologías Mundiales that Arturo Escobar and Gustavo Lins Ribeiro started quite a few years ago. And this was a very informal kind of gathering of different anthropologists doing work on really the theories of anthropology in different parts of the world. So that would be the grassroots, let's say, mobilization, and there were others in other parts of the world. On the other hand, there is this institutionalization drive that has been going on. For example, the World Council for Anthropological Associations, or the revitalization of the IUAES, or the internationalization of the AAA itself. So we have a tension between these grassroots moments and these institutionalization moments. And I would also like the speakers to address this from the point of view of their own experience. The other issue I would like the speakers to address is the position of the actual individuals who acquire a brokerage position. So the people who make it happen, so to speak, who are really putting a lot of effort in this conversation, how are they being conceptualized by their own peers in their own countries, in their own local environments of anthropological sciences, no? Because I think that in some cases they are viewed as facilitators of something that is really important, which is this new worldwide anthropological environment. In other cases, they are seen as opportunists, people who are really furthering their own individual careers through these means. And in some other cases, they retain an ambiguous kind of position, kind of trickster position in a certain way. Finally, I think that the question that we all need to address is what difference has it made to anthropological knowledge, this experience of at least 10 years of trying to establish an ongoing and a stable conversation between different kinds of anthropology. I would present now, the speakers are going to be talking in the order that we have in the program. One of our speakers who is in the program, João Pacheco de Oliveira, could not come, and he very kindly, Antonio Carlos de Souza Lima, who is the president of the Brazilian Association of Anthropology, has agreed to come to the round table in its place. So we will have first Faye Harrison speaking from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and Faye has been the president of the IUAES, or is the president of the IUAES. So, thank you.
Good afternoon, and thank you for the invitation to participate. I've been a member of the IUAES since 1993, and since that time I've been mostly active at the level of commissions. Within the last, I guess, 10, 12 years, I was elected to the executive committee, and 2 years ago I was elected president. So I have 22 years of experience at different levels of the IUAES. And I'm going to be talking about why I became involved with the IUAES, because it was very much influenced by my membership and my active participation in the AAA, which I joined in 1979. And since then, since as a graduate student, assistant professor, and on, I was very active in the Association of Black Anthropologists, another ABA, becoming, after doing whatever needed to be done, president. At two different junctures, I served on the board of the AAA, so I've seen and witnessed and been a part of, a participant observer of the AAA through several restructurings of governance, through shifts in our intellectual discourses and what have you. So my remarks are influenced by that double role that I have played. For much of its history, the IUAES was the principal organization charged with the mandate of internationalizing the discipline of anthropology. Today, there are newer networks and organizations, such as the WCAA, whose missions are to contribute significantly to that work, while more established national and regional associations, among them the AAA, have grown more transnational in their orientations, activities, and memberships. In some of my US colleagues' eyes, the AAA is no longer simply a national organization. And when they attend AAA meetings, they see them as international conferences organized under the aegis of an association with considerable academic capital, that yields career-building dividends. As a consequence of these developments, the IUES faces a much more complex terrain to navigate as it attempts to secure its footing in the epistemic and institutional ecology of world anthropologies. Its potential efficacy in this endeavor depends on different kinds of strategic relationships, partnerships, alliances, and modes of brokerage and mediation than what was the case in the era of, say, soul tax. I've been a member of the AAA, as I said, since November 1979. At that time, I had a passionate sense that anthropology could be much more than it was and had been as a field of largely Eurocentric studies of humankind across time and space, particularly focused on non-Western colonial and later post-colonial subjects. I had a notion then, and I still do now, that what anthropology can become if pushed in new directions away from its Eurocentrism and Northern Hemispheric centeredness, away from its androcentrism, and away from other salient isms that work against the professions becoming a more democratized and decolonized space for facilitating and framing pluricultural and multinational conversations about the commonalities and variations that characterize human societies and human beings. Over the years, I found kindred thinking colleagues in the AAA, where I was part of a network that launched what I called an intervention for decolonizing anthropology in the late 1980s and early 1990s. So I've devoted a considerable amount of my career working with my colleagues to transform anthropology, and particularly US anthropology, which is the center of the hegemonic North Atlantic epistemologies that we're often talking against, organizing against. I've been working with my colleagues to impel US anthropology to realize that just because US anthropologists work all over the world doesn't make them exemplars of progressive multiculturalism or proponents of what we now recognize as world anthropologies. I've been part of an ongoing struggle to get more of my colleagues to acknowledge that the structural and epistemic terrain upon which we perform the labors of our anthropological work is configured in ways that permit some of us in the profession to enjoy unearned privileges and unfair advantages related to domestic and global white supremacy. White supremacy is understood not simply in terms of phenotypic reductionism, but in terms that Arturo Escobar delineates when he writes of white privilege being at the crux of global coloniality in its defense of a Eurocentric way of life that worldwide has historically privileged white people, and particularly since the 1950s, those elites and middle classes around the world who abide by this outlook at the expense of the masses of non-European and colored peoples. Perhaps unwittingly, many anthropologists are guilty of this. My interest in building alliances led me to the IUAES, a logical direction to follow after having the experience of decolonizing anthropology stateside. And my experiences over the last, what did I say, like 22 years in the IUAES have been mixed. Overall, very positive. I can say that from my vantage point, working with colleagues from all over the world in the Commission on the Anthropology of Women and on the Executive Board is affected my thinking as an anthropologist. It affects how I go about doing my research and my scholarly writing. And I'd like to think that those close colleagues from around the world who have 22 years experience with me de-essentialize the notion of US anthropology to realize that the hegemonic model very often is guilty of erasing a lot of the differences, the disparities that exist in anthropology as represented in the AAA. So much of my struggle and my work has been to reclaim, to bring from the margins to the center the varieties of anthropological voices, theoretical perspectives, experiences that make up the totality of what we call US anthropology. And the AAA has been the site and the forum for most of those, or at least many of those debates, whose outcomes are reflected in the program, in the proliferation of sections, and the fact that small sections now can be represented on the board of directors, because I remember years ago that was not possible. And so a section like the ABA did not have a voice or representation on the board. And when that shifted, we were there. And very often in situations where we develop alliances with other associations. Oh my God. All right, so for me personally and my smaller circle of colleagues in the IUAS, I think that this multinational, intercultural experiment perhaps has been positive, but let me say in terms of the other side and the questions and misgivings I have about this project and its ability to produce enduring as opposed to ephemeral, cosmetic, tokenistic changes, is that basically, as I said, the dividends for building careers, the academic capital that the AAA embodies, the IUAS and most other associations cannot compete. And even though in the WCAA everyone has one voice, I think in the broader structures of the neoliberalized and corporatized academia in this country and internationally, it is an uneven playing field structurally, all right? And so we have to figure out how to go beyond the rituals of democratization in order to penetrate more deeply, so that those of us who play mediation or broker roles do not fall into the trap unwittingly of becoming tokens or becoming part of a buffer zone rather than facilitators of the types of epistemic and organizational structural transformation that I think world anthropologies and the earlier decolonizing anthropology discourse and project highlighted. So thank you.
So thank you very much, Faye. So now we will have Sandra López Varela from the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México.
Thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this great group. In an upcoming article in American Anthropologist, I address the challenges behind the process of internationalization of the academic profession in emerging economies. In contextualizing my analysis, I would like to offer an explanation as to why are we gathered today to discuss this large-scale phenomena named internationalization. Internationalization is a knowledge-driven economic growth strategy admitting that higher education is of paramount importance for poverty reduction. According to the World Bank's policy constructing knowledge societies, higher education launched by a highly skilled workforce leads to innovation and new technologies, indirectly building human capital and increasing national income. This scenario requires high-level scientists, professionals, and technicians trained in world-class universities. For emerging and developed economies, it isn't so easy, and I'll let you know why. Internationalization has been predominantly developed and designed from a US and European perspectives, where the teaching, research dynamics, and infrastructure are very different from those that prevail in emerging economies. Even if the idea of internationalization implies growing and building on local academic practices, when we look closely, we have ended up with a dominant system of higher education homogenizing international and intercultural knowledge, skills, and values, impacting the international ranking of our own universities. Rankings privilege academic institutions in Western and Central Europe and our neighbors to the north, making the global playing field far from equal. In one of his many writings, Philip Albach discusses that in the absence of necessary funds and infrastructure, internationalization is not possible in developing countries. In response, these countries have opted for the financial support of the World Bank or the OECD to improve the quality of higher education, and therefore adopted their knowledge economic growth strategies, for example, the tuning model, that has introduced significant changes to the academic setting as it recognizes a set of 12 disciplines contributing to the knowledge society in which anthropology is not included. Mexican state universities find themselves changing their internal structural organization in order to upgrade their programs and prepare students for global citizenship. The anthropology program at the University of Morelos, where I used to work, has been modified at least twice since 2010. Since the tuning model is already in place in the US, you shouldn't be surprised that government officials and Forbes magazine consider anthropology simply irrelevant, despite the highest employment growth rate finding itself within our fields of studies in both countries. After practicing internationalization for more than a decade now, Mexico has not improved its GDP. The explanation is very simple. According to the OECD, aspiring to a world-class research and education environment requires an investment of $39 trillion when Mexico's current GDP amounts to $1 trillion. This is the amount needed for Mexico to reach the high-level performance of Finland, the PISA World Benchmark for excellence in education. Even if full-fledged internationalization is an inconceivable goal for Mexico, its universities are under great pressure to attract highly qualified faculty and talented students. Let's explore whom they are hiring and what are they facing. The knowledge economy has created a demand for internationally linked high-quality research and professionals. At the center of the term highly qualified faculty is a measure called internationality, a worldwide movement in higher education requiring specific competences. For example, international students from some parts of the world more than others, being part of international research networks, again, valuing some networks more than others, establishing international programs, and even studying or doing research abroad. For the first time, the AAA has reached to the Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft and the Deutsche Akademische Austauschdienst in this venue to promote among you research opportunities in Germany. Measures of quality research and productivity include a research profile demonstrating active publication in strictly peer-reviewed journals, national and international recognition, invitations to professional meetings, awards, among other meeting criteria. The sum total of this criteria implies that Mexico's researchers ought to be fluent in the English language. Publishing in international journals, specifically those included in the Science Citation Index, entails publishing in English. Therefore, publishing in English enhances the chance of being cited by others and needed assessment of one's influence in the world of science. It is a problem for all of us writing our local journals that too many colleagues, in English-speaking countries do not read or cite such journals because they lack Spanish language skills. In submitting my article to American Anthropologist, I was first asked to translate all my foreign references into English, and I refused. I follow Patty Peterson and Robin Helms in wondering whether the US government is really committed to the broader ramifications of internationalization, and also if the AAA is ready to face them. Even if papers in Spanish are welcomed, what would have happened if I had delivered the discussion in Espanol? Would you have attended? When I was a member of the AAA Executive Board, I had my students prepare a report on gender participation at the 2012 annual meeting. In drawing a geographic map of the 5,000 registered participants from 67 countries, they found out that most came from English-speaking countries, 4,000 located in the US alone. And only 73 scholars came from Latin America. Half of them were Mexicans. Why so few people from Latin America attended AAA? Beyond limited resources, attending the AAA requires competence in English, a language not everybody embraces fluently, even professional scholars. When I represented Mexico's 120 top scientists and alumni of Germany's Alexander von Humboldt Stiftung, among them Nobel Prize winner Dr. Mario Molina, I found that many fellows in the social sciences and humanities had limited knowledge of English. Their recognition, however, was tied to their speaking of German, the second language of science, according to UNESCO. Most of us non-English speaking members of the AAA are part of an elite trained with great efforts at prestigious multilingual schools and universities around the world, or at least come from a background in which our families could afford to pay for English language courses outside public schools. It is an illusion to think our speaking of other non-Latin languages empowers us back home, or that I represent Mexican anthropology at this round table, based only on my nationality. Along my own professional career, I have embraced the enrichment brought by international networking with scholars from other cultures and working environments, but it comes with a price. Those of us trained in an English-speaking environment face a generation back home with arguably different values. We have accommodated internationalization in a network world, developing skills and styles of collaboration that have made us different. Many leaders of Mexican scientific institutions and universities belong to a generation that embraced socialist ideas in the 1960s, opposing anything dealing with the Anglophone world, and have reproduced these values among their students. In following Mexican institutions' frequently contradictory rhetoric and practice that is promoting internationality and internationalization, this generation is not welcoming the ideas we acquired abroad, and it is not ready to accept the new research fronts we have been trained for. The Secretary General of the Alexander von Humboldt Stiftung has stated openly that in the absence of a welcoming culture in our own countries, much is wasted, financially and in terms of human capital. Without a welcoming culture, most likely, the generation trained abroad will leave the country physically or intellectually to work in an environment where their talents are more appreciated, as it has been my own experience. There, such scholars would achieve higher research standards, and the higher those standards and international recognition, the less likely it is that these colleagues would find suitable cooperation partners back home. This scenario compromises any desired macroeconomic effect of promoting economic growth in any country, as these proxies and the work that we do may only augment the GDP of that welcoming country. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra. So now we will have Antonio Carlos de Souza Lima, who is the president of the Asociación Brasileira de Antropología.
Well, I would like to thank the Committee for World Anthropologies, the American Anthropological Association, the World Council for Anthropological Associations, and particularly Susanna Narodsky for the invitation to participate in this roundtable discussion, as well as Bella Feldman-Bianco for suggesting my name. My training has been in Brazil, and almost the entirety of my research has been conducted in my home country. So I'm not exactly the kind of mediator that Susanna was talking about. Like many other researchers, however, I have long had my contacts with colleagues in other countries and indeed throughout Brazil, which is in and of itself a very diverse place. I began studying the anthropology of the state in the early 80s, intersecting anthropology, history, sociology, and political science, and focusing in general of state politics for indigenous peoples and on Brazil's own internal processes of colonialism and imperialism. I am quite conscious of the fact, however, that my work has had little, if none, impact in the discipline international circles for a series of reasons. Some of these have to do with linguistic issues and costs of translation. Others involve the costs in time and resources of attending international events. Still others are related to the hierarchies of legitimacy within each national anthropological context and tradition with regards to adequate objects of investigation. In truth, few Brazilian anthropologists have their work widely recognized within the discipline's mainstream, although many of us also maintain relationships with a variety of colleagues and attend many international congresses. I believe that these were some of the conditions that the World Anthropologists, Rede de Antropologias del Mundo network, sought to confront through associativism and through exploring the political epistemological possibilities and impacts of the network's proposals. This movement has gained strength This movement has gained strength through the leadership of researchers situated outside the United States, but who were often trained as doctors of anthropology within the US. A key moment in the formation of this tendency in its institutionalization was the constitution of the World Council of Anthropological Associations in 2004 during the meeting of the Brazilian Anthropological Association, ABA, in Recife, under the presidency of Gustavo Lins Ribeiro, the WCAA's first facilitator. I was then ABA's vice president, and can say that together with the creation of the virtual Brazilian Anthropology vibrant journal, this action anticipated what funding agencies in Brazil would later demand, giving Brazilian anthropology a good leg up on much of the rest of the country's academic scene, so to speak. I am speaking here of what has since come to be called internationalization, whatever that means. By taking these steps, Brazilian anthropology stretched beyond its participation in international congresses and events and began establishing more frequent contacts outside of Brazil, and indeed began to engage more frequently in research outside the country as well. The WCAA was added to this general scenario, as was more recently greater Brazilian participation in the IUAES. The Brazilian anthropologists who have become active in these circles have generally been trained outside of Brazil, most of them, but not exclusively, in the US, and they have sought to present Brazilian anthropology production within these transnational space's typical forms. In some cases, this is done through a stereotypical reading that seeks to facilitate understanding. An example of this can be seen in the frequently encountered idea that Brazilian anthropologists are generally listened to by the powers that be in our country, which is not exactly the case. It is true that we anthropologists and ABA in general are positioned to contribute to many different public debates, and that we have had a long tradition of activity within the public and political sphere, often in strict cooperation or dialogue with many Brazilian social movements and collectivities that are our primary interlocutors. The situation should not be understood as a general rule, however, nor is it necessarily something engaged in by those Brazilian anthropologists who propagate this stereotype in international forums. In the case of Brazil, I believe that it has been through the presidency of ABA, either through the direct involvement of that organization or through that of its presidents, that Brazilian anthropology has managed to become institutionally engaged in these spaces. Our professional associations' evaluation of Brazilian situation are certainly not cohesive and often fall into what we may call the mediator's dilemma. They trying to respect both sides of debates at once. They are also sometimes perceived by certain people as favoring international connections and issues in detriment to national one. Often, however, this view is flipped according to the exigencies of the actors in scenario of a given situation. And we are accused of being excessively parochial in our views. When we turn to evaluating the repercussions of these processes in the global scenario, I believe that the movement launched by World Anthropologies Network, together with WCAA, in which has helped to lead to the creation of the Committee of World Anthropologies, has been very important. What it has not done, however, is led to effective changes in epistemological or in the balance of power within its members' national context, at least speaking from Brazil. Thinking about the situation from Brazilian perspective, I am under the impression that one was intellectually quite potent in its beginnings, but has since run around on a certain rising routinization of charisma within the WCAA within the last few years. It would be interesting to compare this with IUAS's long history. That organization had little impact in Brazil, although many of my colleagues have participated in the congresses of IUAS. I believe that in order for us to obtain the objectives laid out in Susanna's second group of questions, it will be necessary for us to go beyond the standard reflections and begin working with common research agendas. We need to engage and integrate students and professionals of every level of formation and from multiple, I've seen. Okay. And begin working with common research agendas. We need to engage and integrate students and professionals of every level of formation and from multiple nations in these projects. And so this engagement and cooperation should not only take in the selection or an investigation of research objects, but should also involve the intersection of critiques and dialogues and of activism. I think that only by interweaving in this manner various academic habitats which engage with and cross-fertilize each other will be able to slowly and gradually create deep and effective change in all national contexts, whether these are understood to be hegemonic producers of theory or peripheral producers of regional ethnographies. Towards these ends, to create experiences for study in other countries, in non-hegemonic countries, with the students coming from hegemonic countries to study and taking classes, knowing the scholarship of the country will doubtless open many new possibilities for our discipline. Speaking again from my Brazilian point of view, we've often seen much excellent work produced by foreigners who have been much more than a fraternal and symmetric presence in Brazilian anthropology. However, we have also often seen young researchers who are only interested in engaging with local intellectual production by treating this as if it were native discourse and who do not seek to deeply understand the traditions of academic discourses in contexts other than their own. To put it bluntly, we see many young foreign researchers who do not seem to understand nor care about what their Brazilians or Mexicans, whatever, colleagues think as anthropologists. If ethnography is the main force for change in our discipline, maybe these new movements will be important for the development of a plurinational and collaborative ethnography. Maybe in the context of large projects undertaken within the European Union, we can see some of these mechanisms. This is a question for Susanna. Already functioning, and thus project future possibilities for these on a more global scale. But for all this to work out, we must first address a key question, which seems to me the one to be one of the most of the real obstacles to all these generous perspectives: financing.
Thank you. So now we will have Gordon Matthews from the Chinese University of Hong Kong.
I'm going to talk about between world anthropology and world anthropologies, an American anthropologist in East Asia as interpreter and as gatekeeper. The globalization of anthropology is no longer simply a desirable future, but rather a present reality. It used to be the case that anthropology consisted of Americans and Western Europeans studying tribal peoples within their colonies. More recently, it is largely has remained the case, and does so today, that anthropology consists of people from rich countries studying people from poor countries. The World Council of Anthropological Associations, WCA, founded in 2004, now has 52 members, consisting of presidents of anthropological societies across the globe, ranging from the United States to Japan to China to India to Chile to Mexico to Tunisia to the Philippines. It holds regular yearly meetings and fosters numerous research initiatives to explore how anthropology may exert global influence. The International Union of Anthropological and Ethnological Sciences, IUAES, at its most recent full meeting in Manchester in 2013, had anthropologists from 69 countries. The American Anthropologist now publishes a regular article every issue on world anthropology. Editorial boards of major journals published in the United States and Western Europe increasingly consist of anthropologists from around the world. All of this testifies to a recent explosion of interest in world anthropology, and more than this, the globalization of anthropology as a discipline. In 1996, Ulf Hanners defined the global ecumene as a world in which we are increasingly engaging with one another in a common forum. Increasingly, this is the case of anthropology. This globalization is inevitably eroding the power of what has heretofore been the intellectual hegemon. The more anthropology is global, the less it is American. The leaders of the American Anthropological Association, its presidents, officers, and administrators over the past decade have been extraordinarily welcoming towards the emergence of global anthropology. However, the rank and file of American anthropologists have not been interested. Panels concerning global anthropology offered by AAA have generally been fairly sparsely attended over the years, as compared, for example, to similar panels offered at IUAES. You know, there are 20 people in the audience right now, and you have the president of AAA and the president of IUAES. Americans don't care, bluntly put. This is entirely understandable. Your average American student or assistant professor probably has more immediate concerns than global anthropology, namely finding and keeping a job within the profession. Who can blame them? But this may be based on a misunderstanding of current market realities. As the United States sheds anthropological positions, East Asia adds them. I know of several dozen American or British trained anthropologists who have been able to find jobs as anthropologists in East Asia in recent years, having been unable or unwilling to be employed at home. Global anthropology is not only an intellectual movement, but an economic movement as well, as other parts of the world, such as East Asia, increasingly began to supersede the Western world economically. I have been an American anthropologist, obtaining a PhD in the US and teaching in Hong Kong for the past 20 years, and thus am in an ambiguous position. My ambivalence is rooted in my simultaneous role as interpreter of East Asian and American anthropologies to one another, but also as gatekeeper. This gatekeeper role includes grading students and evaluating their research proposals, evaluating the research proposals and tenure applications of professional anthropologists, and, as an editor of Asian Anthropology, evaluating submitted articles through referees as to their possible publication. All these activities involve me, as an American-trained anthropologist, evaluating the work of anthropologists from other intellectual traditions as to their quality. If anthropology is indeed one, if there is a single global anthropology, then my judgment may be apt. However, if there are multiple global anthropologies, then my judgment and my capacity for judgment is questionable. When, for example, as editor for Asian Anthropology, I demand that a Chinese or Indian or Pakistani anthropologist rewrite a paper, this may represent my effort to make this paper meet global standards for anthropological publication. Or, on the other hand, it may represent my imposition of American standards on other anthropologies, my exercise of American hegemony. When I tell a mainland Chinese graduate student in my university that her research proposal is not interesting and she needs to rethink it, this may represent the universal training of anthropology graduate students everywhere. Or it may represent my role as an American gatekeeper, telling students from a different intellectual tradition of anthropology that they had better conform to my American standards or they're out. Obviously, both of these are to some extent valid. There is a common global anthropology, or at least aspects of a global anthropology. This is why I can teach with some degree of confidence. I've never yet had a student or colleague say, "You can't understand what I'm doing because you're American trained, but I was trained elsewhere." On the other hand, there are indeed significant differences in national traditions. I've written about the referee system as a barrier to global anthropology, and indeed it is, in the sense that referees, and teachers too, are gatekeepers, enforcing, to at least some extent, hegemony, whether it's American hegemony or other hegemony. Both of these views, both of these aspects of world anthropology on the one hand and world anthropologies on the other, have their legitimacy. The problem is how, in particular situations and circumstances, these two perspectives can be disentangled. World anthropology, based on the idea of a single global anthropology, necessarily involves a singular vision of what anthropology is and should be. And this tends, given the world today, to be Western anthropology, and particularly American anthropology. Different anthropologies around the world continue to more or less take their cues from the theories of American anthropology. Now, this is unpleasant to think of, but it's true. I look at Japanese anthropology, I look at Chinese anthropology, Indian anthropology, Latin American anthropology, I think, although I know less clearly, what theories did they use? Go back to the core, go back to America. They're the people who are always cited. Why? Why can't you cite people from your own country? Why can't you cite people from elsewhere? This is what we see. However, there are ongoing features of American anthropology today that make it distinctly unsuitable to be the world gatekeeper and hegemon of anthropology. The trend in anthropology over the past 50 years, since Geertz and the postmodern wave that followed him, has been to write in a more and more complex and literary way, one that in its complexity privileges native writers and speakers of English. This has made American anthropology less comprehensible to non-native speakers of English, and thus more provincial. Earlier American anthropologists like Ruth Benedict, Margaret Mead, and Marvin Harris write for a larger audience. But this is generally no longer the case, with the great exception of David Graeber. American cultural anthropology is generally distinctly harder than in earlier eras for non-native speakers of English to understand. This is due partly to trends within American anthropology itself, but also to some other larger structural features. The tenure system, requiring advances in theory every few years for a new generation of junior academics, as is not the case in a number of other societies. It's also due to the publishing system in the United States, whereby academic publishers and university presses have enough readers within the anthropological world itself to make it largely unnecessary to reach an audience beyond the anthropological world. This is not the case elsewhere. In a number of other countries, you've got to reach a larger audience, but not in America, so American anthropologists do not generally try to reach outside the anthropological world. They write almost entirely for themselves and their students. As I earlier discussed, I am in the middle between world anthropology and world anthropologies. Nonetheless, in a globalizing world of globalizing universities, we are moving away from world anthropologies towards a single global world anthropology. This is absolutely inevitable in the coming decades, I think, but will also bring into increasingly sharp relief the conflicts of evaluation that I earlier described. One can only hope for the emergence of a global anthropology based not in native speaker English, but in a universal English, or in multiple languages, or in computer language, computer translated languages, enabling more and more of the world's anthropologists to communicate with one another. One can also hope that world standards of anthropological citation will become ever broader, leading citation indexes like SSCI to increasingly represent not just the West, but the world, as is resoundingly not the case in present, as was discussed, as you discussed. I am convinced, because of Western relative economic decline, leading gradually and indirectly, but inescapably, to the relative decline of American and Western anthropology as well, that other anthropologies, particularly those of East Asia, but a range of other societies as well, will increasingly contest American anthropological world hegemony. We now live in a multipolar world of political power. Increasingly, we will live in a multipolar world of anthropological power and anthropological influence. This will involve world anthropology more than world anthropologies, but it will involve a range of competing anthropological centers, an anthropological world that will allow for far more diversity than does the anthropological world today. This, I think, will be a far better anthropological world than that of today, and I very much look forward to seeing its ongoing emergence. Thank you.
Thank you. So now we will have Yasmin Arif from the University of Delhi.
All right, that was hopefully going to keep you distracted from what I'm going to say. I've never been part of any professional association, and my engagement with the World Anthropology group is specifically in relations to questions of theory and philosophy, epistemology and method in anthropology. And my profile, which I think is kind of important to lay out right up front, and I hope it's not too disorienting to the group here. I am educated in India. I teach in India in a department of sociology that uses both sociological as well as anthropological approaches. This is a department which was established right after the independence of our country, and therefore it came with all that you know about post-independence departments. In that department, I apparently have been one of the first, or the first person who's gone out of the country to study another region in the south. I went from Delhi to Beirut in Lebanon for my first research work, which is my doctoral work. And now my work on the politics of life and violence covers India, Africa, and the Levant. So that's the confusing place that I come from, and I thank Susanna for making me part of this panel and making things even more confusing for world anthropology. So, but in spite of this confusing situation, for more than a decade now, I have been part of the World Anthropologists Network, and I've been a proud member, I have to say, and that I hope qualifies my presence here. Now, in response to the brief that Susanna gave us, let me engage with both questions, but in one frame, I think, and that frame I will borrow from Derrida, or rather what I'd say is a typical Derridian turn of meaning for a very commonly known phrase that would imply a world of meaning, and literally for us in world anthropology. The words that I'm going to try and pay attention to is testimony and evidence. So before I explain what they mean for us today, let me start with the first question that Susanna posed for us, which is what Brokerage positions as this enterprise of worlding professional anthropology endorse within and outside the AAA. We have heard of the various groups that we do have. For this, I'll take your attention to the World Anthropology section that was started in 2014 in the American Anthropologist that Sandra has spoken about. I cannot, of course, summarize adequately the wealth of information, the views, the perspectives, the passions, the powers, and the politics that has been written about by many anthropologists covering a potentially infinite range of positions. Bringing them under one cover is an achievement, a signal of world anthropology coming of age. Yet, I cannot feel a slight sense of déjà vu. When I place these essays in front of that fairy tale truth mirror, the reflection, or I might say, the shadow that I find reflected is once again the area studies paradigm. There is an undeniable resonance of a classificatory system. We discuss country, Ireland, Mexico, these are the places that have been mentioned there. We recognize region, South Asia, Latin America, East Asia, and so on. In that, we understand a range of topics of research, from folklore to colonialism to globalization, and of course, to hegemony, dominance, and the metropole. I know that this is an undue reduction, but however, to make my point, let me suggest that the relationship has not taken us too far away from the self-other dichotomies that the area studies paradigm had spawned, but now the gloss takes on a different sheen. We are now imagining a global theater of staging where many of us are called upon to play our character roles. But neither the characters nor the script has really changed. This is where I go back to testimony and evidence, and I'd just like you to pay a little bit of attention to the slide there. This is Derrida from a very little-known book called Autobiographies. And he says that a testimony has never been or should never be mistaken for evidence. Testimony in the strict sense of the term is advanced in the first person by someone who says, I swear, who pledges to tell the truth, gives his word, and asks to be taken at his word in a situation where nothing has been proven, where nothing will ever be proven for structural reasons, for reasons that are essential and not contingent. It is possible for testimony to be corroborated by evidence, but the process of evidence is absolutely heterogeneous to that of testimony, which implies faith, belief, sworn faith, the pledge to tell the truth, the I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Consequently, where there is evidence, there is no testimony. The theoretical order, that is the order of evidence, must be foreign to the element of credit, faith, or belief implied by the testimonial pledge. A little apology to Gordon, these are slightly postmodern words. But nonetheless, what connection do I find between these words and the range of relationships that the World Anthropology Initiative sponsors? One idea that I will suggest is that the evidence as to what anthropology is, its correctness and truth value, who speaks the discipline and who does not, literally the I, the first person, is centered. Which roles are to be cast and played are still decided from a position of centrality. The power of this evidence is about how the others are to be recognized and given their rightful place, often in good faith. It almost feels like the debates of the multiculturalism debates of the 1980s, where you place and find a place for the various cultures, and they are expected to play that role. Now, in that sense, this evidence gives us the technically correct sense of anthropology to which the other world anthropologists pose their testimonials. The constant tone of negotiations, if you go through the essays in the World Anthropology section in the American Anthropologist, is like that of offering testimonials with faith, with truth-telling, which appeals to credibility. To keep this brief, I'm suggesting a clean look at the kinds of subject positions that are being cast when world anthropology mirrors area studies. I'm asking for another glance at what identity stereotypes we are continuing to sustain and what are we going to create. Though they emerge out of the ressentiment of wounded peripheries, we might want to think if we are not too quickly being co-opted into a roster of stereotypes in the scramble for citizenship in world anthropology. The question for me is not so much a world map of contiguous but separate territories, but more about sharing a common discipline. What I'm really asking for, therefore, is that we need to think hard about what do we really mean by saying that we want to do world anthropology in both theory and in practice. Now, in that intent and using the same ideas of testimony and evidence, I turn to the second question, which is knowledge and power in the internationalization process. And I'm going to give you a very simple take on that. While we try and find our places on a global map, how do we bring the world into our classrooms? Now, if you can imagine with me a classroom in an American or Northern university, it's a room full of students from across the world, and from within, listening to and learning from the comprehensive syllabi on anthropology with a capital A. That's what you were talking about. And this is the evidence that I'm talking about. And then proceeding, these students will proceed outwards to the world. Some return to their own territories. Others travel far from their own. Americans or Northern students usually go far out to the poorer countries. They're all profiled, they're fitted with appropriate language training, area-focused research proposals, reading lists, etc., all to contribute towards anthropology with a capital A. While in my classroom, and I expect I speak to some of us in this global map of world anthropology, I speak to many students, but they're almost always from the region of South Asia, moving on to India, who will only stay, study, and work in India. What is my syllabus that when I'm teaching? Do I treat anthropology with capital A as evidence and provide local knowledge as testimonies to anthropology? Or should it be the other way around? Will I be a local hero if I teach Gandhi, the Vedas, or an indigenous anthropologist? I usually combine, but I suppose like most of us in my position do, but this is really in context to what you was talking about, Gordon, in terms of referee. I tried unsuccessfully to publish a long time ago an essay around these issues in a journal called Critical Anthropology, and the reviewer told me that if it wasn't directed at me, but said anonymously, that if the writer wants to talk about these issues, why is she using Deleuze? Because I use Derrida and Deleuze, etc. So there you go. So this is really much truer than you think. But while, as I said, I do try and combine anthropology with capital A and all the anthropologies with accents as best as we can, but even then, I cannot but hear the insistence, and this is the last little set of words from Derrida that I want to use again, that I do not wish to transform myself into a diaphanous mouthpiece of eternal pedagogy. Now, again, I really don't want to take much more time than I should, but I rather want to draw attention to the question of pedagogy and anthropology combined with what we are really intending to do with this thing that we are calling world anthropology, and to understand it reflexively and generously to how we can sustain an inclusive, integrated discipline and not a fragmented, disintegrated intent. In my classroom, I would want to think about and also convey what place method and epistemology play in creating the knowledge, the theories that I speak about and that I aspire towards in the making of what we can all call anthropological knowledge. I do not want to be just another utterance in a cacophony of voices and languages. I do not want the dilution of integrity in the name of multiplicity, nor do I want to be a diaphanous mouthpiece of eternal pedagogy. In other words, my aspiration today has been to express my sincerest appreciation for world anthropology, but at the same time to ask for an anthropology of the world. And in the spirit of the theme here in this conference today, where the relationship of familiar to strange is not a slash, but a hyphen, not a separation, but an ensemble. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yasmin. So Now, our last speaker is Monica Heller, President of the American Association of Anthropology, Anthropological Association.
Yes, you're going to be secretary on Monday. You better get that right. So I feel in some ways I'm a good bookend to Faye, insofar as we both embarked on journeys, Faye's from the US to the IUAS, mine as a Canadian working in Canada, working on Canadian issues, to president of the AAA. And in that sense, perhaps kind of, there are times when I feel like I'm the embodiment of familiar strange, actually. The journeys, I think, are both journeys that are framed by decolonization in different ways, and I'll come back to that in a moment. So yes, the AAA as hegemon. I'm going to actually try to undo my academic habitus and not talk for very long, because one of the things that I think hegemons have to do is shut up and listen most of the time and not talk. And so I'll try to be brief. So everybody here has mentioned the various ways in which we have the AAA as hegemon, US-centric in its theoretical and methodological frames, in the substantive questions it asks, focuses on even the political engagements, the ways in which, this has not been mentioned yet, the ways in which North American anthropology, and here Canada works pretty much the same way, as a 4 or 5 field, depending on how we count anthropology, as opposed to the way it's organized elsewhere in the world. Sandra's mention of the problem of the English language. Bien souvent que j'ai juste envie de plus parler anglais ici. And so we have a number of different problems of hegemony. These are, particular issues, but ones that I think we need to take a look at in terms of what we want to retain and what we can possibly work with and what really needs to be worked at. I tend to think of the problems of hegemony generally and how to work through what this means for the AAA as hegemon in 2 forms. One is the one we usually talk about, which is the access to knowledge produced as anthropological knowledge. But there is also, to my mind, more importantly, the problem of access to the position of knowledge producer, a producer of anthropological knowledge, legitimate producer of anthropological knowledge, and to the position of definer of what counts, what has value as anthropological knowledge. So I think we get this embodied in moments such as the one that Gordon referred to when we referee articles, for example. So these are the problems we're struggling with as a space. This meeting is a space where both of these things happen, right? And that we have to think about. But I think also, I know that as a space of knowledge production, of attribution of value and meaning to that knowledge, we encounter 2 different kinds of, let's call them problems, issues maybe, things we have to deal with. So the first is the one that Yasmin, I think, just referred to, which is the problems that we all struggle with of the nation-state frame, or maybe the area studies frame, as really constraining. This is maybe a version of what Antonio Carlos was talking about as the financing problem, right? This really constrains in very practical ways the production and circulation of anthropological knowledge. And I'm often in conversations where people say, well, it's the American Anthropological Association. And I'm like, yeah, but that was 1902. And so what do we want to, what do we do with that now, recognizing that that nation-state frame is in many ways less about opportunities and more about obstacles in all kinds of different directions. But there's also the problems of contradiction with the anthropological enterprise. And here, again, my colleagues have referred to the questions of the encounter with anthropology's engagement with colonialism, complicity with colonialism, past and present, and the way in which that's triggered, I think in some productive ways, processes of reflexivity and attempts at least at decolonization. And we can argue about whether that is, those have been done well or badly, but I think, we can see them as there. And in that respect, I share, if you like, Gordon's surprise and possibly dismay that these are issues that we talk about a lot in this space. And yet the connection between what we're trying to do here and how that is being declined elsewhere in the space now, those connections are not being made. And so those are connections that I think we have to work at making more explicitly, probably with a bit less meta talk and a bit more actual engagement with substantive issues. So these are issues of power and how it works and how we use anthropology well to do things in the world that we want to do. So clearly, for the AAA as an organization, this has led to some very deliberate efforts to engage with being the hegemon and with trying to understand what it means to decolonize ourselves and to be good citizens in a global efforts at decolonization, which are not just, and I appreciate Faye's use of the word transnational as opposed to international. I think that's actually really, really important, but also within the frame of the nation state, there's all kinds of ways in which there are issues that just don't line up with the nation state frame at all. And so these are, of course, as Gordon pointed out, connected to being overtaken by the facts of changing relations of power in global geopolitics. And so that's part of how we have to actually think through what that means for us and what it means to take up a speaking position in this particular moment of major transition, of major change. And so one of the ways in which we've seen that done deliberately has been through the institutionalization of an attempt to try to grapple with these issues through, for example, our Committee on World Anthropologies, despite Sandra's, or maybe Sandra's horrible experience with American anthropologists, actual attempts to try to deal with multilingualism and to try to understand what it means to for English to be, not just here, but elsewhere, a global language, a dominant language of anthropological knowledge production. And we've also tried to do it through various kinds of forms of collaboration with sister associations. I worked with Bella and with Susanna on a virtual webinar. So, what I call baby steps, but some ways of kind of taking our place alongside our sister associations, which, like us, remain constrained by the nation state or area studies frame, but we have, these are things that we can work with and through multilingualism, but also through moments when we need to say to ourselves, and we do try to say to ourselves, okay, as I was saying earlier, time to shut up and listen. So these are struggles, but I think that the way forward is to try to struggle well. Susanna asks, what difference might all of this make to what counts as anthropology, what counts as anthropological knowledge? And my response to that is actually, who knows? But let's find out.
Thank you. Well, thank you all very much. I think these presentations have been really very diverse and very, at the same time, convergent in many ways. So I would now want to ask the audience to engage with the speakers here. So, yes. Excuse me, do we have a mic? Yeah, you should please use the mic. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Can you hear me okay now? Yeah. I have a very low voice. I'm just curious too. I really appreciate the different perspective, but I'm wondering too that in addition to the area focus and in addition to our training, which we are, especially in the United States, we're trained to be lonely anthropologists, and we don't do much collaboration. There are two things that I'm wondering about. One is, and this is for the entire panel, how do you see, in addition to educating anthropologists, the collaboration of anthropologists with the communities with which they work? In particular, thinking about more activist kinds of work, and especially applied areas of anthropology. I know that in Mexico, most Mexican anthropologists work in Mexico and look at issues that revolve around the people of Mexico, which is very different than in the United States. So I'm just curious about two things. One, about the whole notion of collaboration, given more of an activist strain, rather than looking at the institutional building of anthropology, but looking also at the problem solving that we I think all are aiming for in a world anthropology. Thanks.
Thank you. So, do you want to answer?
I hope I understood the question. I'm very sorry that I can't address you because I have the
Yeah, we
the
have these
lights on, so I'm just going to look this way. It is true that Mexican anthropology or Mexican anthropologists have always worked in Mexico. I'm one of the few examples that has worked out in Belize, that has also worked in Arizona as part of my training. But I belong to a very different generation. And the problem right now is that many Mexican anthropologists and science in general, I mean, this is not only happening within anthropology, because internationalization, it's a global policy that is being directed from the World Bank and the OECD. There's basically no escape. So now all those established and well-known Mexican anthropologists are being forced to be part of this dynamic that, for me, I'm already used to it because I'm a younger generation. And so it is inevitable. And to me, it is very painful to see some of my professors that they're about to retire and they still forced to produce 10 articles per year, demonstrate citations, attend conferences. So this is just, and the reason why they're doing it, it's because internationalization has an effect in our salary. So this time, within the economic dynamics that are happening around the world, it was really hard for me to be at this meeting. So I really thank the AAA for having me granted the possibility of being here. But not everybody can afford, and I'm just wondering if this continues, whether I'm going to be able to continue coming, and if I don't come, then I will see repercussions in my salary and the status that I have to have in order to prove that I'm working in Mexico.
Yes, I don't know, Yasmin or Antonia, do you want to?
I can just say, I can stand up. Again, I can't look that side because of the lights, but very quickly, I mean, even though your question was much about Mexico, like Sandra, even I'm the only person who's moved out of India to work in another region. Now, one thing I think we do go on a lot about, in a certain sense, attacking the hegemon of the American anthropologist. Part of the problem, and I'll come to Sandra's point later, part of the problem is that in our area studies, there isn't that much effort, and part of it is also because of the financing issue. We don't have the money to get out of the country. We have to work in India. Our students never get any fellowship, leave alone going abroad. We don't have money to sustain them through their doctoral programs. So the issue is far more complicated than that, but the internationalization issue is actually a very dangerous trend that we even have, which is a little different from you, but we have the same issue. In India right now, the problem is so schizophrenic, which is that on one hand, we have to have all what is called an auditing system of how many conferences, how many articles, etc. But I am not going to be given leave to come to this conference because it's outside India. So there is a lot of schizophrenia in our institutions. It's not a very simple, question-answer way of dealing with the problems. It's a far bigger issue. But at the core of what I thought you were asking is that I think we certainly need to spend more time thinking about what we intend the produce of world anthropology to be. Is it collaboration? Just because that's already been happening. But what is really at stake is something far different, I think, which is the worldwide way in which the map of education is changing. And that is something that I guess we need to pay attention to.
I think that Brazil has a very interesting experience that it's not part of the internationalization core, the core idea of internationalization. Is the relationship with Portugal and the relationship with Argentina and now with other countries in Latin America, particularly Colombia. Now we have a wave of Colombians in Brazil. That's the way we started listening much more to our fellow Latin Americans and skipping the position of being Latin American. And I think that what I was trying to say is that in general, it's not a rule also, Brazilian anthropology tries to establish a symmetrical relation. Brazilian anthropologists, not all of them, tries to establish symmetrical relationships regarding other traditions of anthropology and try to understand what is at stake for anthropologists and not as data of area studies. And I can say that I learned a lot about Argentina, and I knew nothing when I started advising Argentinians, and I advised various students. And also I'm now trying to understand Colombia by means of my students' work and trying to read Colombian anthropology in order to understand the questions they bring to us. Well, it's not a rule. We have anthropologists going into Africa and applying very globalized tendencies that come from Brazil with no discussion of scholarship about Africa, applying ideas, theoretical ideas that have no relation with that context. It can be something interesting, but trying to apply as we applied hegemonic anthropology is just reproducing the same position. And so I wouldn't say that everything is marvelous in Brazil. We have imperialists also, and more symmetrical references. And symmetrical don't necessarily means that reverse anthropologies and things like this. If I
Okay,
make
yeah,
myself understood.
so now maybe Monica, Gordon, and Faye, you want to, okay. So what about you? Yeah.
Very quickly, in East Asia, but many other places, there's a direct contradiction between activism and internationalization. For this reason, anthropologists are increasingly encouraged to publish in SSCI journals, Social Science Citation Index journals. Those are overwhelmingly Anglo-American journals. What that means is you have to present your argument not for locals, but for that distant foreign audience. That means that anthropologists are in effect rendered politically unable to speak out within their own societies because all their time has to be devoted to writing for the distant hegemon.
But I'd like to say that I didn't get to say that in my role as a broker, liaison, I said it's a mixed bag. But basically, I feel totally ineffective because my colleagues in the AAA and in the USA are totally indifferent to internationalization, but in part because of the transformations that have occurred within U.S. anthropology, the transnationalization, and the fact that, I guess, the world anthropology model of and paradigm for rewards in career building and validation sort of emanate from that. So in a sense, they're disincentives for them to go beyond and transcend those hegemonic boundaries. And the global political economy has affected the North as well. So rank and file academics in this country cannot afford to go to IUES meetings, et cetera, and it's unlikely that their universities or their departments of anthropology are going to lobby for them to make a priority to go to domestic conferences and have those conversations and whatever, as well as these conferences outside of the United States so that they can decenter U.S. anthropology. I see some of the applied work, or actually the activist work, the truly collaborative, not collaboration that really masks the sort of coloniality of power relations, and, you know, as basically a critique and a way to work against the grain of the hegemon at home. Because I've came to from two other sessions today, and we were addressing from different points of view this, but a lot of the activists are not necessarily addressing the 50 people at the hegemon who want to read the abstruse, dense, French-driven theoretical analyses. These are people who are writing in publicly accessible ways. They're including in their audiences members of the populations where they have worked. For instance, Gina Ulysse, a Haitian American anthropologist, just published a book in a triptych in 3 languages, in one bound copy, English, French, and Haitian Creole, because she recognizes that even though English is the global language, that doesn't mean that even people who have some competence in it can really engage texts and ideas comfortably in that language. And of course, she includes Haitians at home and everywhere as a principal segment of this multinational global audience. And so that's affected how she publishes, for whom the language you talk in, even if you're publishing in English, to speak in a way that code switches into accessible language so that, you know, so much of the name dropping and the abstruse stuff we do is to claim elite status, and so we're preoccupied with that. But there are anthropologists, I think, who align themselves with struggles on the ground, and I think that has reverberations and ramifications at home. And so I think a number of fascinating precedents have been set within, in a sense, these are members of the AAA or the SFAA that basically there are people who should be your kindred spirits and allies and brainstormers with the world anthropology proponents. And so that's my point. Within domestically and internationally or transnationally, some of us for years have been making parallel arguments, but we don't know each other, we don't read each other, and so forth. And so a divide and rule tactic means that we're going to fail.
Can I add to that a little bit, please? Yeah, I'm sure there are questions, but this is just in conversation with this, that someone who's just used a French theorist, is that part of the problem is that if we are world anthropologists outside the center, then we must be doing something which has to be politically correct and has to be done with the air of activism. I think some of us wish to do theory, wish to do epistemology, which has to be on par with French theorists or any other theorists in the world. I think that distinction between what is correct and what is not so correct has to be rethought a little bit in this endeavor.
Yes, so I think now we still have like a quarter of an hour, and we could take a few questions from the floor, and then our speakers would engage with them. So, please, yeah. Okay, so please go to the microphone and reach, okay. It's the same, I mean. Okay.
Okay, sorry, hello. Well, I come from a country in South America, Ecuador, whose knowledge production has been very, very few in, and now I am here trying to do that paradigm shift. But when I arrived, the first thing I heard here, I am doing my PhD here, and the first thing I heard is that I have to publish or perish. So I said, okay, I have done a little things, a little publications in not so cited journals. But I said, okay, I can do it, I can write. But suddenly I said, okay, it's not enough my writing, my English writing skills. But I have found here that it is also a English writing perspective. And I have that struggle at this moment. I write, but suddenly people who has to review my work has a different, extremely different perspective. So that's my question. Okay, we can write in English, we can express ourselves in English, but how can we publish in English? And also, one day I asked myself, is this publishing apparatus is a capitalist hegemony also? Is still so much that we have to do because it's not so easy to publish. I think that maybe Latin American journals need to, improve, or I don't know what can I do. I'm just doing my PhD, but I think that that's a problem. We can write in English, but where can or how can our work be reviewed without that hegemonic perspective in English writing?
Yes. So can we have another question? Yeah, Richard. Yeah.
It's really a comparative question. To what extent do you think that this is a worse problem in anthropology than it is in other social sciences? Because although I'm certainly not an expert in economics, but I read The Economist, and I constantly see South Asian economists being being quoted at quite a high level. Equally, in history, any self-respecting historian who is writing about South America or Asia will automatically be quoting local South American sources, South American historians. So to what extent is it, I'm not saying it's not a problem in other social sciences, but it seems to be much more of a problem in anthropology than it does in some of the others. Is that a correct reading, or have I just got it completely wrong?
Thank you. So maybe you want to answer? Yeah.
So I just want to make a couple of quick comments. First to the first speaker, and here I'm going to speak because I represent the hegemon, with 22 journals in anthropology. So this is where I think it actually is really important to struggle. When Faye was talking about this book, Gina released this book in 3 languages, I'm like, where did you find a publisher to do that? I have been spending my entire career banging my head against a wall, mainly in vain, right, on that one. So, so here we have an association with 22 journals in the midst of a deep reflection about the wildly changing publications market, political economy, if you like. This can be scary, but it's also a moment of opportunity. And so if we try to look at what those opportunities are, I think this is a moment when sometimes there are moments, historical moments, when we have to struggle. It's not going to be handed to us. It's not going to be done for us. we're not even going to be able to figure out where exactly we want to go until we get there. But this is a moment when the door is opening. And I would, I would encourage anybody who wants to push at the English language domination door, to do that and to do it in the context of, what it means to publish. Yes, we have publish or perish, but what it means to publish is no longer all that clear. It entails fights with your department. It entails fights with your granting agency. It entails making things hyper explicit and clear, but sometimes that works. So, two very small examples. A number of years, about 20 years ago, a colleague of mine originally from France and I decided we're going to submit an article to the hegemon in our field, to Langage et Société, published in Paris, right? And we got it back with, oh, your French is terrible. And why are you busy spending all of this time telling us about your stupid methodology? We don't care. So we wrote back and we said, you know what, Langage et Société, you don't get to make the rules anymore. In North America, we think talking about methodology is important because, and we won that fight. Okay?
How did you win? Did they just agree with you? What?
We made them feel really, really bad about being imperialist, fill in the blank. Okay? So to get an article from Canada and France, and then to have us say, yeah, we've had enough of this colonization. Thank you very much. Although there's settler colonial. I mean, I won't go into that. So it's possible, and you have to choose your fights, and it's exhausting, but that's what we have to do. To just try to quickly address the second question, I like to think that, and my experience with other disciplines is more with disciplines like linguistics, for example, that because of what we do, we're hitting this wave first, maybe, I think maybe historians are also in a similar position. So we're encountering it first. That's a good thing. And we should use that, and we should use it well.
But the 2010 UNESCO and the International Social Science Council published a world report called Knowledge Divides, and it deals with the social sciences completely, and anthropology is represented, but it shows that a lot of the structural epistemological questions that world anthropology raises really do prevail across the social sciences, except they're more perhaps heightened amongst us because of the nature of our discipline and its position in the historically deep international division of labor among the social sciences, as studying all human beings, but as I said in my presentation, particularly non-Western. I mean, we have baggage about that, and we are talking back to ourselves, being self-critical about that, and you don't find necessarily political scientists, economists, doing that. But it turns out that this hegemonic structure and this political economy, it affects all the social sciences. So you're going to find that in Africa or whatever, that those social scientists, perhaps with anthropologists bearing the brunt, that they are stuck in a peripheral site of knowledge production, analysis, and theorization for the sort of understood reasons, and that legacy is being reproduced by what I call the recolonization through contemporary neoliberal globalization, which has affected academe worldwide. So.
One very quick comment on the referee system. This is very close to the ground in answer to your question. Most journal editors pick people they know. and they pick people roughly within the circle of their acquaintances. And in an American setting, that tends to mean people who unwittingly serve as American gatekeepers. Nobody intends that. That's entirely unwitting. But, you know, referees will say things like, well, this paper really doesn't deal with anthropology, in the way I understand it, which means often American. Now, the increasing internationalization of anthropology does mean a broader pool of referees. It is changing, but unfortunately, since you need to publish now, you may still be a victim of this ongoing national gatekeeper function of the referee system in the way that anthropology is now set up.
Regarding also the first question, I can relate to your problem because I went through it. In fact, whenever I was sending articles to prestigious journals, they would say that my English was not good enough, so I better find a translator or an editor to so I could publish the articles. So that has always been on the table. But now that I have helped translate some of the abstracts that people have to write in Spanish for them to publish in a journal that requires a Spanish abstract. I mean, I'm very surprised that most of my colleagues are using Google Translate to do that. So every time that I receive a Google Translate abstract in Spanish, I send it back. And I said, if you're requesting me to write, because it's very different to speak in English and to go outside and grab a cup of coffee. Really writing in English requires a very different skill. And when I'm reviewing those articles in English, I'm also very surprised that many people that are native speakers, they don't know how to write in English. So it's something to think about. It's not, I don't even think that it's a matter just of knowing a language. It's like even knowing your own. And in regards to the second question, I just wanted to insist that because this is a global policy, it is affecting all sciences, from physics to chemistry to history to the social sciences and the humanities. The pressure that we're having in Mexico, it is beyond belief because there are two options, and I know many people that have decided already not to be part of this, but usually they don't have families. So it is a lot of pressure for us that have families not to be part of the system. So, I mean, I just remember that I'm going to be now teaching for Chinese students, and I might be sent by my university to China because of the agreements. The more agreements you have, the more international networking you have, there's a higher possibility that we would impact our GDPs. So Mexico's university, National University, it's the highest ranked university in Mexico. I think only with Brazil, sometimes we're just struggling whose university comes first. But it's exactly, we're in the same dynamics. We need to prove that we have international students, that we're publishing in international journals, that we have, we're having we're developing international networking, we're working with international colleagues. Right now, most of the agencies that are financing my research are from Germany, not even from the US. So that even gives me a little possibility. I mean, I enjoy the work, but but it's a lot of pressure, and I do appreciate that good side of internationality because to me it has been a very fulfilling experience. But I also recognize the pressures and the horrors it brings.
So yes, I think this gets complicated. Just going against the grain one more time, I think we would have to think through the idea of language a little more carefully. It's because of English that we're even sitting in this room and talking to each other. Having accepted that, I would also try and draw your attention to a country like India, where we have more than 2,000 languages, and if people were to start writing in their own languages, you wouldn't know which to translate to what. So while I do understand the absolute problem of having English as a hegemonic language and the intent of world anthropology, I think part of the problem is that we are once again looking at it only from our own area. If it is to be world anthropology, however negative certain language issues are, we have to be able to communicate to other regions, and this is what I think I wanted to go with the comment made earlier. I think it is absolutely important that we need to understand what is this project about. Is it about providing a sense of anthropology which is about conceiving of this thing called world anthropology? Or is it about really mapping out a space for each one of these identities? It is a complex question, and I would really go on and on and on about building up method, building up a sense of epistemology, and before thinking, because our relationships have always been with the hegemon. Once you start thinking laterally, the language issue also becomes very complicated. I don't know Spanish, I never will, I suppose. I use Italian philosophy, I don't know Italian. But so where do I stand? I can only read English translations. I know 4 other languages in India, means nothing to you in this room. So we have to think through that problem a little bit more.
Yes, well, we've run out of time, I'm afraid, but thank you very much to all our speakers, and thank you also to the anthropologists who have been willing to sit with us and share with us this session. Thank you.